Hello, welcome to my kitchen. I'm Yogini Katrina, and today you and I are going to make tomato soup. So the first thing that we have to do when you're making tomato soup, of course, is get everything ready. But even before that, make sure you put on some dark clothing, because if that soup splashes up, it's going to make your next laundry load a nightmare. So let's get started. So the ingredients that you need for this quick and easy tomato soup is chicken broth. I prefer the low sodium, reduced sodium, simply because there's already sodium in the tomato juice that you also need. If you notice here, the can of tomato juice is 1.36 liters. You can also use a smaller can if you want a smaller batch of tomato soup. Next up, we have a can of stewed tomatoes. And it's up to you. Always buy the best that you can afford, or in a pinch, whatever you have in your pantry. The next item, we have some dried basil, basil, however you say it, tomato, same thing. And 2 tablespoons of that will do this full recipe. You can use fresh basil, but it's going to cost you a lot more money, especially if it's out of season. The next ingredient, we have 2 tablespoons of brown sugar. And the brown sugar just helps to take the acidity out of the tomatoes. Next ingredient, we have 35% whipping cream, 1 full cup. Please make sure you use full 35% whipping cream. You don't want your soup to split. If you walk away from it and it boils, then you haven't got a chance of saving it and you'll have to throw the whole batch out. As far as vegetables go, you can do nicely with a single yellow onion, a couple of carrots depending on their size, 2 or 3 ribs of celery. If you like the flavor of celery, add a little bit more. And of course, equipment-wise, you need an immersion blender or a standalone blender, a nice sharp knife. And if you notice over on the stove, I have a nice big pot. So get your equipment together, find that dark shabby t-shirt to put on, and we can start cooking. So here we are, ready to get started. The first thing I'm going to do is turn on my heat source and add a little bit of olive oil to the pan, just enough so that I can saute my vegetables. Don't need much, tablespoon or 2, that's all. So I'm going to turn my heat on full. It's going to take a few minutes to get going because I have an electric stove. I'm going to let it heat first and then add my tiny little bit of olive oil. And again, same goes for olive oil that goes for everything else. You don't need the fanciest kind. Buy what you like and buy what you can afford. It's all about living your life. So, chopping the vegetables. You want to start with the onion, cut it in half. Now, soup doesn't really matter how big or small you chop your vegetables. What matters is how fast you want them to cook. Are you in a hurry? Cut them smaller. If you have lots of time to let your soup simmer gently over the afternoon, go ahead, cut them a little bit bigger. In the end, we're going to throw the immersion blender in the pot, and everything's going to end up the same anyway. So I'm just going to do a nice rough chop. Onions first, just to get that out of the way. I hate chopping onions, and I hate the smell on my fingers afterwards. Oh my gosh. Onions done. Next, we're going to chop the carrots. Now the carrots we're actually going to add to the pot first because they take a little bit longer to cook. I have 3 carrots here today, but really, if you like carrots, put in more. You do need to have this blend. It's called mirepoix. It's the classic blend of the aromatic vegetables: onion, celery, carrots. Just gonna chop these 2 carrots. I'll get to the 3rd one in a second. I'm going to check my pan to see if it's hot enough for the oil. Just gonna put my hand to see if I can feel the heat through it, and I can. I'm not touching it, I'm just feeling the heat starting to come up from the bottom. So I'm just going to add a tiny little bit of oil. I'm just going to eyeball it because with cooking, it really doesn't matter. That looks pretty good to me. Now I'm done with the olive oil. Got 1 more carrot to chop. Again, size doesn't matter. It's all going to be well cooked. Now I'm going to throw this into my pan just to get it started. Carrots and onions first. Oh, I can smell it. I don't know if you can hear the sizzle, but it's coming. Make sure you always have a nice wooden spoon to use with your pots, with your cooking. Doesn't add any flavor to the food. And of course, a wooden spoon doesn't get hot like a metal spoon can. Just allow it to stir, coat the vegetables in the oil. Now I'm going to chop the celery. Again, nice rough chop. Nothing too fancy. You don't have to worry about getting hooked up on knife skills. That's for show-offs anyway. Oh, I can smell the celery. This is beautiful celery. Luckily, it's in season right now, so it's really cheap. 99 cents for a whole bunch, and I only need 2 ribs for this whole recipe. Carrots, also in season. I think the carrots cost me, well, the whole bag of carrots cost me $1.97. I only had to use 3. Give it another stir. Starting to heat up, things are going nicely. Now with everything, when you're cooking something like a soup, you have to layer the flavor. So every time you add an ingredient, you also have to season. Now, tomato juice, canned tomatoes can already have a lot of sodium in them, a lot of salt. Even the stock, though it's reduced sodium, it still has sodium in it. So I'm choosing not to add any salt to this recipe, except at this point right now to season the vegetables. Just a tiny little bit of salt. Oh, wrong drawer. So I'm just going to put in a couple of pinches of salt just to help the vegetables begin to release their moisture. That's it. Now, where's my, pepper mill's over in the corner. So I'm going to add some fresh ground pepper. Fresh ground pepper is always the best way to go if you've got it. So just grate it in. And again, with cooking, any kind of cooking recipe, not baking, you can do it to your taste. Now we're going to be adding pepper throughout the recipe, so try not to overdo it right in the beginning. You can always add, but you can never take it out. Whoops. Basil goes in the pot and begin to stir. Now, if you were using fresh basil, I wouldn't add it just yet. It's because we're using the dried basil, I've added it with the vegetables. The dried basil is going to begin to absorb the moisture from the sautéed trinity of vegetables that we're using today, and then it will begin to release its flavor a little bit more. Next up, we have to let that cook for a few minutes just so that they soften a little bit more. So if you need to, grab yourself a drink and be right back. So now it's time to start adding our liquid ingredients. The first thing I'm going to do is put our canned tomatoes into a bigger bowl. Just pour them in. And when it splashes, that's why I put on the dark t-shirt. Now, this is a great place to get your kids involved if you like, because what we want to do is break up these tomatoes. So you just put your hand in and give them a really good squeeze. So now we're going to add them to the pan. Smells so good in here. Can of tomatoes. No, can of tomato juice. Pour that in. 1 package of low sodium chicken stock. This one is 900 milliliters, so it's just short of a liter. Almost 4 full cups. Add that in. You would have to take out the cream if you were serving a vegan. But if you're serving a vegetarian, the cream is fine. You always ask, of course, if anybody has any dietary restrictions when they're coming to your house. And pour that in too. Now, I'm going to add a little bit more pepper. So this is what the soup looks like when you've just added the cream. In a few moments, I'll take another shot after the soup has boiled, and you'll see how it becomes this rich orangey red color. It's beautiful, and I'm sure your guests and your family will think so too. So here we are. We have been cooking for about 10 more minutes, and you can see the soup has changed color just slightly. It's gotten a little bit darker. So now it's time to add the brown sugar and use the immersion blender. But if all you have is dark brown sugar that you use for baking, making cookies, then you can go ahead and use that. Same thing, 2 tablespoons. And you just sprinkle it in. Give it a stir. We're gonna do one more little blast of black pepper. One more stir. Now I'm just going to bring this pot slightly off the heat, just pulling it away just a little bit. I'm just going to adjust the camera so that you can see. And now we are going to use the immersion blender. If you do not have an immersion blender, you can just as easily do this in your standalone blender. It just takes a little bit of time. So all you do, right in the pot, you can blend it until it is as smooth as you like, or you can leave it a little bit chunky. There, that's all there is to it. I'm going to turn the heat down to a simmer, and I'm just going to let it cook for about 10 more minutes, and then it's ready to serve. So how do you serve your soup? Well, it depends who your audience is. If you're serving to kids or kids at heart, I suggest grilled cheese. Now, I like to dunk my grilled cheese in my soup. So just for a fun little thing, when I was little, I of course had my boiled egg and toast soldiers. So think of making grilled cheese soldiers to go with your delicious tomato soup. Now I suggest you wait for the grilled cheese just to cool slightly so that the cheese doesn't ooze everywhere. You want it to be just as cheesy as it is tomato-y. And then of course, just place them on the edge of the bowl. Delicious. Grown-up dinner party, you can serve the same soup, but with a little more flair. So I have here some cherry tomatoes that I've washed, and I'm just going to cut them in half. You probably only need 2 for a bowl. Sprinkle them on the top. A couple of cherry tomatoes right there floating on the top. Now I also have a homemade crouton that I put in the oven. To make a homemade crouton, I like to use rye bread, and I just brush it with some olive oil, put it in the oven at 350, and it's ready to go in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to slice it, chop it into nice big croutons. Oh, it's crunchy. I can smell the olive oil. It smells delicious. Again, just 3 or 4 croutons per bowl. That's all you need. On the top, and of course, a little bit of fresh grated cheese to appeal to the kid at heart. No matter how fancy your dinner party is, we're all just little kids inside. So there you have it. Grilled cheese for the kids and grilled cheese for the grown-ups. Now you could also add diced sun-dried tomatoes and a little splash of olive oil, but I think simple is always best. So until next time, please enjoy.